Welcome to the WW2 archives, where we follow the money that fueled the greatest conflict in human history. September 2nd, 1936. A confidential memorandum lands on Adolf Hitler's desk in the Reich Chancellery. The air in his office is thick with cigarette smoke from the emergency economic meeting that just concluded. The document, stamped streng geheim, top secret, contains a single devastating sentence buried in columns of financial data. Germany's foreign currency reserves will be completely exhausted in 8 weeks. Not 8 months. 8 weeks. Without foreign exchange, Nazi Germany economics cannot import the oil, rubber, and raw materials keeping the military-industrial complex running. Without imports, the factories building the new Wehrmacht grind to halt. Without the Wehrmacht, the regime collapses. Hitler reads the memo, crumples it, and makes a decision that will kill 50 million people. Fast forward to August 1939. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and the financial architect who'd seemingly rescued Hitler's economy from Depression-era ruins, pens his resignation letter. In it, he writes words that should have stopped World War II before it began. The present financial and economic policy leads Germany inevitably toward catastrophic inflation and economic collapse. The methods employed cannot be sustained beyond 1939 without triggering total systemic failure. He's describing the Nazi war economy as a terminal patient on life support, warning that the miracle everyone believes in is actually a financial time bomb. Hitler files the letter and invades Poland 3 weeks later. This is the story most WW2 documentaries never tell. Not the story of ideology, racial hatred, or territorial ambition, but the story of money, debt, and economic consequences of war that made global conflict not a choice but an inevitability. This is The Wages of Destruction, the revolutionary economic analysis by historian Adam Tooze that reveals how Hitler's economy created a trap from which the only escape was conquest, plunder, and ultimately, annihilation. The WW2 war machine didn't start because Hitler wanted war. It started because Nazi Germany economics couldn't survive peace. The illusion of the economic miracle. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany amid economic devastation that had broken the Weimar Republic. 6 million unemployed. Industrial production collapsed to 58% of 1928 levels. Banks failing. Farmers losing land. Desperation in the streets. Within 4 years, foreign observers would marvel at the German economic miracle. Unemployment virtually eliminated, massive infrastructure projects, gleaming new highways, a rearmed military that seemed to prove Nazi Germany economics had discovered some revolutionary formula for prosperity. It was all a lie, and The Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze exposes that lie with brutal precision. Walk down any German street in 1937, and you'd see the propaganda's evidence everywhere. The Autobahn construction sites where 100,000 men worked, building highways that stretched toward horizons that promised a motorized future. Posters showing muscular workers wielding hammers, proclaiming, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. The factories humming with activity, the military parades displaying new tanks and aircraft. Hitler's economy appeared to have cured the Depression through sheer force of will. But step into a German worker's apartment and the illusion crumbles. Kurt Meyer, a metalworker in Essen, kept meticulous household budgets that survived the war and appear in Tooze's research. In 1933, Meyer's family consumed 2,850 calories per day. In 1939, after 6 years of the supposed miracle, 2,435 calories. His real wages, accounting for inflation and the cost of actually available goods, had fallen 25%. His wife Greta wrote in a diary entry from March 1938, "The posters show workers eating meat and smiling. We haven't had real butter in 5 months. The ersatz coffee tastes like burned grain. We are told we are prosperous, but our stomachs no different." This was the reality across Nazi Germany economics. Adam Tooze's analysis of Reich Ministry of Economics reports reveals the shocking truth. German workers in 1939 earned, on average, half of what American workers earned. German living standards had actually declined under Nazi rule when measured by consumption, nutrition, and purchasing power. The economic miracle was a carefully staged theater production, magnificent from the audience, elaborate sets and dramatic lighting, but backstage was chaos, shortages, and improvisation masking fundamental poverty. The Wages of Destruction documents how this deception worked through several mechanisms. First, the regime eliminated unemployment not by creating prosperity, but by military conscription, removing 1.4 million men from labor statistics, compulsory labor service, another 500,000, and pushing women out of the workforce, reclassifying 800,000 as not seeking employment. The actual number of productively employed workers barely increased, but the unemployment rate dropped to zero on paper. Second, the gleaming autobahns and public works created jobs, but produced no consumer goods. A worker building highways earned wages, but had nothing to buy with them. Industrial production was diverted entirely toward rearmament. Tank factories don't produce refrigerators. Aircraft plants don't make washing machines. The regime was creating employment by building weapons that would either rust and used or be consumed in war. Third, the regime controlled prices through authoritarian decree, creating the appearance of stable costs while actual shortages mounted. Tooze's examination of German government economic records shows butter consumption fell 20% from 1933 to 1939, meat consumption fell 15%, clothing production fell 12%. Prices stayed fixed, but goods simply weren't available. Housewives queued for hours for inferior products. The prosperity was rationing disguised as full employment. The Nazi war economy was actually generating less civilian consumption than the Weimar Republic at its depression worst. A Berlin family's household budget from 1932 shows higher caloric intake, better nutrition, and more diverse diet than the same family's budget from 1938. The difference? In 1938, the father had a job in a munitions factory. He was employed producing bullets, earning wages that bought less food than the unemployment benefits of 1932 had purchased. Foreign observers were fooled because they saw the surface, the parades, the construction, the apparent activity. William Shirer, the American journalist in Berlin, wrote in 1937, "Whatever one thinks of their methods, the Nazis have eliminated unemployment and revived German industry." He was describing the stage production, not the economic reality. The British ambassador reported to London that Hitler's economy had achieved remarkable recovery. French economic analysts worried Germany was pulling ahead. What they couldn't see were the Reich Ministry statistics that Tooze excavated from archives. The foreign currency crisis, the mounting debt, the resource shortages papered over with ersatz substitutes. They couldn't see the internal memos circulating in 1936 warning that the entire system would collapse without either drastic cuts to military spending, politically impossible, or acquisition of foreign resources through conquest, economically necessary. The Wages of Destruction reveals that by 1936, 3 years before the war, Nazi Germany economics had reached an impasse. The regime could not sustain military buildup without imports it couldn't afford. It couldn't afford imports without exports it couldn't produce. It couldn't produce exports because all industrial capacity was devoted to rearmament. The economic consequences of this contradiction were mathematically certain. Either abandon rearmament and face regime collapse as the economy contracted, or pursue military expansion to seize resources that could sustain further expansion. The miracle was actually a countdown clock to war, and every German economist paying attention knew it. They just couldn't say it out loud. The Mefo bills, financing the unfundable. March 1935. In an ornate conference room in Berlin's finance ministry, Hjalmar Schacht orchestrates the most audacious financial fraud in modern economic history. The man is brilliant, arrogant, and about to create a wartime finance mechanism that will fund the entire Nazi war economy for 4 years while hiding the true scale of German rearmament from both the German public and international observers. The problem Schacht faced was simple and insoluble. Hitler's economy needed to spend 35 billion Reichsmarks on rearmament, but the government couldn't possibly raise that through conventional means. Tax revenue was insufficient. Foreign borrowing was impossible after Germany had defaulted on Versailles debts. Printing money would trigger hyperinflation, the trauma that had destroyed Weimar Germany in 1923. The Reichsbank's own bylaws limited government borrowing. Schacht's solution was to invent a new type of money. The scheme worked like this. The government created a shell company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft MBH, the Metallurgical Research Corporation. The company, nicknamed Mefo, existed only on paper. It had no employees, no factories, no research facilities. Its sole purpose was to issue promissory notes, Mefo bills, that worked as follows. A German arms manufacturer, say Krupp, would sign a contract with the Wehrmacht to build tanks. Instead of receiving immediate payment from the government treasury, Krupp received Mefo bills, essentially IOUs guaranteed by the government but issued by this private corporation. Krupp could then take these bills to any German bank and exchange them for actual Reichsmarks. The bank accepted the bills because they were guaranteed by the Reichsbank at 4% interest. The whole system looked like private commercial paper, not government debt. It was financial alchemy, and Schacht knew exactly what he was creating. In his memoirs, published decades later, he wrote, "I was fully aware that this system represented a postponement, not a solution. We were issuing promissory notes that could only be redeemed through future economic expansion or, failing that, through the acquisition of foreign assets. In effect, we were financing rearmament with money that didn't yet exist." This wasn't economic analysis, this was economic prophecy. Schacht had created a wartime finance system that could only work if Germany conquered its neighbors. The signing ceremony establishing Mefo in March 1935 was deliberately mundane. Representatives from 4 major industrial concerns, Siemens, Goethe-Hoffnungschutt, Krupp, and Rheinmetall, sat in a windowless ministry office, signing incorporation documents for a research company with 1 million Reichsmarks in nominal capital. The air smelled of ink and old wood paneling. None of the signatories spoke about what they were actually creating, a mechanism to hide Germany's rearmament from the Versailles Treaty restrictions and international scrutiny. Think of it like this. Imagine using a credit card to pay off another credit card, then creating a third credit card to pay off the second, except the third card's credit limit is guaranteed by a promise to rob a bank in the future. That's the Mefo bill scheme. The Wages of Destruction reveals through Reichsbank documents that by 1938, the total value of Mefo bills in circulation reached 12 billion Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to Germany's entire annual tax revenue. The industrial leaders who participated knew exactly what was happening. Gustav Krupp, head of the Armaments dynasty, told his board in a 1936 meeting documented in company archives, "We are being paid in government promises. When these promises come due, there are only 3 possibilities: hyperinflation, government default, or territorial expansion that brings in foreign assets. The first would destroy us, the second would destroy us, the third." He paused, letting the implication hang. The third meant war. German bankers who were required to accept Mefo bills grew increasingly nervous as the system expanded. Records from Deutsche Bank's executive meetings in 1937 show directors questioning whether these bills were actually sound. One executive, Karl Ritter, wrote in an internal memo, "We are holding 450 million Reichsmarks in Mefo bills. If the government cannot redeem them, if the system fails, our bank becomes insolvent. We are, in effect, betting the institution's existence on the regime's ability to, what? Conquer Poland? Seize Czech gold reserves? The economic logic terrifies me, but we have no choice but to participate." By late 1938, the Mefo system was approaching collapse under its own success. The Reich Ministry of Economics records show that bills were being issued faster than they could be redeemed. The scheme had created a parallel economy where actual money and Mefo bills circulated simultaneously, but the ratio was getting dangerous. If confidence wavered, if banks refused to accept new bills, the entire military-industrial complex would shut down overnight. Schacht understood the endgame perfectly. In his resignation letter from January 1939, which the Wages of Destruction quotes extensively, he warned Hitler, "The Mefo bill system has provided 12 billion Reichsmarks for rearmament, but these bills must be redeemed. The Reichsbank cannot continue guaranteeing commercial paper indefinitely. Either we curtail military spending dramatically, or we acquire foreign exchange and gold reserves sufficient to back these obligations. The second option requires extraordinary measures." Extraordinary measures was financial euphemism for invasion and plunder. Walk into a Reichsbank vault in early 1939, and you'd see the physical evidence of this scheme. Filing cabinets stuffed with millions of Mefo bills, each one a promise to pay bearer on demand. The bills themselves were printed on high-quality paper with elaborate anti-counterfeiting measures. The regime wanted them to look more legitimate than government bonds. But stack them all together, and they represented promises the government had no conceivable way to keep except through conquest. The Wages of Destruction demonstrates that the Mefo bill scheme made war inevitable by 1938-39. The bills began coming due in 1938. The government couldn't redeem them through normal revenue. Printing money to cover them meant inflation. Defaulting meant the entire banking system would collapse as banks holding billions in Mefo bills became insolvent. The only solution was to acquire gold, foreign currency, and industrial assets from other countries. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938. Adam Tooze's economic analysis shows it was timed precisely to coincide with a Mefo bill redemption crisis. Austrian gold reserves, 280 tons, provided temporary relief. The seizure of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Czech gold reserves and industrial assets allowed the regime to keep the scheme running for 6 more months. But each conquest only postponed the reckoning. And by August 1939, the economic consequences of the Mefo system left Hitler with a mathematical certainty: invade Poland and gamble on plundering enough resources to keep the scheme afloat, or watch the entire Nazi war economy collapse under the weight of unredeemable promises. Schacht had created financial perpetual motion, a machine that could only keep running by constantly consuming new fuel. And the only fuel available was conquest. The American fear, why Hitler knew he'd lose. Summer 1938. Adolf Hitler's Reich Chancellery Office. An economic intelligence report sits on his desk, delivered by the Wehrmacht's Economic Warfare Division. The document, recovered from German archives and analyzed in the Wages of Destruction, contains industrial production comparisons between Germany and the United States. What Hitler reads in those pages fills him with something close to existential dread. American steel production, 1937, 51 million tons. German steel production, 1937, 19.8 million tons. American automobile production, 1937, 4.8 million vehicles. German automobile production, 1937, 331,000 vehicles. But the number that truly haunts him is this one. The Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan, a single factory complex, produces more vehicles in 1 year than all of Germany's automotive industry combined. Hitler underlines this figure. In the margin, he scrawls in his characteristic angular handwriting, "This is what we face if America enters the war." Albert Speer, who would become Minister of Armaments, later recalled Hitler's obsession with American industrial capacity in his memoirs. He spoke about American production numbers the way other men spoke of terminal illness. He knew the figures by heart. He would recite them late at night, sometimes to himself, calculating and recalculating how much time Germany had before American industry turned against us. "If they build ships like they build cars," he told me in 1938, "we drown. If they build tanks like they build tractors, we are crushed. Everything depends on winning before America decides we are the enemy." Let's step into that Ford River Rouge plant in 1938 and understand what terrified Hitler. The complex sprawled across 2,000 acres in Dearborn, Michigan. Stand at one end, and you couldn't see the other through the industrial haze. The sound was a continuous, mechanized roar, the thunder of stamping presses that could shape steel at 500 tons of pressure, the rhythmic clang of assembly lines moving at speeds German engineers thought impossible, the scream of cutting tools slicing through metal with precision that German manufacturers couldn't match. Raw materials entered one end of the River Rouge plant. Iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, rubber from Southeast Asian plantations, and finished automobiles rolled out the other end 28 hours later. The plant employed 100,000 workers and operated on a scale that represented a different industrial philosophy entirely. German manufacturing still relied on skilled craftsmen, making components that were assembled by hand. American manufacturing had industrialized the very process of manufacturing. Wehrmacht economic analysts toured American factories in 1937 under the guise of commercial delegations. Their classified reports, documented in the Wages of Destruction, read like scouting reports from a football team, realizing they were about to play a professional squad. The Americans have achieved production efficiencies we believed theoretically impossible. A single plant in Detroit produces more aircraft engines monthly than our entire industry produces quarterly. Their supply chain management integrates raw material extraction, transportation, processing, and assembly into systems that eliminate bottlenecks we consider inherent to industrial production. One analyst, Major Werner von Braun, not the rocket scientist, submitted a report that the Reich Ministry of Economics tried to suppress because it was too demoralizing. He wrote, "American industrial production operates at a scale that makes competition meaningless. Their economy produces surplus capacity as a byproduct of normal operation. In war, They could redirect civilian production to military output and overwhelm any opponent through sheer material mass. The economic analysis is unambiguous. Germany cannot win a sustained industrial war against the United States. The numbers told a story of two different economic realities. The wages of destruction breaks down the comparisons with brutal clarity. American electrical power generation, 117 billion kilowatt-hours annually. German electrical power generation, 55 billion kilowatt-hours. American aluminum production, 148,000 tons. German aluminum production, 98,000 tons. American machine tool production, $465 million. German machine tool production, $153 million. But raw numbers don't capture the qualitative gap. American industry had something Nazi Germany economics couldn't replicate: economic depth. German factories operated at maximum capacity, producing military goods. American factories operated at 60% capacity, producing consumer goods, with massive surge capacity available for military production. German industry had bottlenecks everywhere: skilled labor shortages, raw material constraints, electrical power limitations. American industry had slack in the system. Hitler understood this with painful clarity. In his table talks, private conversations recorded by aides and analyzed by historians, he returned obsessively to American industrial power. August 1942 entry. The Americans can lose 10 times what we lose and still replace it within months. They waste resources we must conserve. They scrap equipment we would rebuild. Their economic surplus is our economic death sentence. This understanding shaped Nazi war economy strategy completely. The Blitzkrieg doctrine wasn't primarily a military innovation, it was an economic necessity. Germany had to win wars in weeks or months because it couldn't sustain the industrial production required for long conflicts. The Wehrmacht was designed for short, decisive campaigns that would be over before American industry could mobilize. Tooze's analysis shows Hitler was essentially running a doom clock in his head, calculating how long Germany had before American entry into a European war. Every month of peace was a month closer to American rearmament. Every year Germany delayed meant American industrial capacity grew stronger, while German resources depleted. The strategic calculus was nightmarish. Attack now while America is neutral and Germany might win quickly through surprise. Wait for better preparation, and America might enter the war before Germany is ready. But German rearmament couldn't sustain waiting because the economic consequences of the Mefo bills and resource shortages were creating their own deadline. German military planners in 1938 estimated they had a 3-year window before American rearmament would make war unwinnable. This estimate, found in Wehrmacht planning documents, assumed American neutrality during those 3 years. If America entered earlier, the window closed faster. If America began serious rearmament while still neutral, Germany's industrial disadvantage would become insurmountable. The fear of American industrial production explains otherwise inexplicable German strategic decisions. The obsession with seizing Soviet oil fields and Ukrainian grain wasn't ideological. It was an attempt to create resource reserves that might let Germany survive a long war against American production. The focus on synthetic fuel and rubber production through the 4-year plan, which we'll examine next, was driven by the knowledge that American resources were effectively unlimited while Germany's were desperately scarce. Speer later testified at Nuremberg about conversations with Hitler in 1941. He told me frankly that the decision to invade Russia was economic, not ideological. Germany needed Soviet resources to have any chance of surviving American entry into the war. He calculated that seizing Soviet industry and resources might bring German production to 60 to 70% of American levels. Without Soviet resources, we'd be at 35 to 40%. Those numbers determined invasion date more than any military consideration. While Hitler obsessed over American factories, German workers struggled with the gap. A Krupp steel worker's diary from 1939 describes visiting a traveling exhibition showcasing American industrial methods. They showed us film of American car factories. The speed of the assembly lines, the precision of the machinery. Our foreman said it was exaggerated propaganda. But you could see it was real. They showed an American worker's apartment. He owned a refrigerator, a radio, a car. We earn half his wages and buy ersatz butter. How do we compete with that? They couldn't. And Hitler knew they couldn't. which meant Germany had to win the war before it became a war of industrial capacity and resource allocation. Exactly the kind of war American economic power was designed to win. The American fear wasn't paranoia. It was the one thing Hitler got absolutely right, and it made him infinitely more dangerous. The four-year plan failure, autarky's collapse. October 1936. Hermann Goering stands before an assembly of German industrialists, scientists, and economic planners in Berlin. The rotund Reichsmarschall, Hitler's deputy, has just been appointed head of the four-year plan, the Nazi regime's most ambitious economic initiative. His directive is simple and impossible: make Germany economically self-sufficient within 4 years. His speech that day, preserved in German government economic records, reveals both the plan's ambition and the desperation driving it. Gentlemen, Goering's voice booms through the crowded hall, the Führer has given us 4 years to achieve autarky, complete economic independence. We will produce synthetic oil from German coal, synthetic rubber from German factories, synthetic everything if necessary. We will become impervious to blockade, independent of imports, self-sufficient in all war-essential materials. This is not optional. This is survival. The smell of cigarette smoke and nervous sweat fills the room. The chemists and industrialists exchange glances because they know what Goering apparently doesn't. What he's demanding is thermodynamically and economically impossible. By 1939, 3 years into the four-year plan, the results would be catastrophic. The Wages of Destruction documents the failure with unsparing detail, showing how Nazi Germany economics became more dependent on imports, not less. The plan to achieve autarky had achieved the opposite, creating resource allocation disasters that made war economically inevitable. Let's start with synthetic rubber, because it encapsulates the entire failure. Germany had virtually no natural rubber production. The plants only grew in tropical climates. Every tire, every gasket, every piece of flexible machinery depended on rubber imports from Southeast Asia. The four-year plan demanded German chemists produce synthetic rubber, Buna, from coal and petroleum derivatives. The scientists succeeded technically. By 1938, Buna factories were producing synthetic rubber. But the economics were disastrous. Natural rubber cost 5 cents per pound. Buna cost 85 cents per pound to produce, 17 times more expensive. The Buna required massive inputs of coal, electricity, and chemical precursors. And the quality was inferior. Buna tires wore out 3 times faster than natural rubber tires. Dr. Karl Krauch, the IG Farben chemist overseeing Buna production, wrote in a confidential 1938 report to Goering, "We can produce synthetic rubber, but we cannot produce it economically. Each ton of Buna requires 2.5 tons of coal that could otherwise fuel factories or power plants. The electrical power consumption for full-scale Buna production would require 15% of Germany's total generating capacity. We are, in effect, converting coal and electricity into inferior rubber at costs that make the entire economy less efficient." Visit a Buna plant in 1938, and your senses would tell you something was wrong before the economics did. The smell hit you first, a chemical stench of processing agents and coal tar derivatives that clung to clothing and skin. The noise was constant: compressors, reactors, distillation columns, all consuming electricity at rates that dimmed lights in nearby towns when the plants ramped to full production. Workers wore rubber boots that cracked and split after weeks instead of months. The supervisors knew the product was inferior, but quotas demanded production regardless of cost or quality. Synthetic fuel faced identical problems. The four-year plan demanded Germany produce gasoline from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch process. Again, technically feasible, economically insane. The Wages of Destruction cites Reich Ministry statistics showing that synthetic fuel cost 4 times more than imported petroleum. The coal requirements were staggering. Producing Germany's annual fuel needs synthetically would consume more coal than the entire German economy used for all purposes combined. One German industrial chemist, interviewed after the war by Allied economic analysts, described the impossible math. To achieve autarky in fuel, we needed to double coal production while simultaneously tripling electrical generation. The steel required for that expansion would require iron, or we'd need to import. The machinery would require machine tools we couldn't build fast enough. The workers would need food we couldn't grow. Every solution created 3 new problems. We weren't achieving autarky. We were building an economic perpetual motion machine that violated the laws of resource conservation. Food presented perhaps the cruelest failure. Germany couldn't feed itself. Import dependency on grain, fats, and feed for livestock was fundamental. The four-year plan demanded agricultural intensification to close the gap. Chemists developed nitrogen fertilizers to boost yields. Farmers were ordered to maximize production. Results? The Wages of Destruction reveals that between 1936 and 1939, German food imports actually increased by 15%. The agricultural intensification required fertilizer, which required chemical plants, which required electricity, which required coal, which required food for miners, a circular dependency that made self-sufficiency impossible. German per capita caloric consumption dropped even as agricultural production rose, because population grew faster and the best food was diverted to the military. German housewives experienced the four-year plan's failure intimately. Ersatz products flooded the market: coffee made from roasted grain, butter stretched with chemical emulsifiers, synthetic fibers that shredded after a few washings. A Berlin housewife, Emma Wolf, kept a diary that historians discovered in the 1970s. Her March 1938 entry: "The ration card allows 100 grams of real butter monthly. The shops only have Reich butter, mostly water and chemicals. It separates when heated and tastes like candle wax. The radio says we are achieving self-sufficiency. My family's dinner says otherwise." The thematic analogy for the four-year plan is trying to fill a bathtub while the drain is open. Every increase in production created increased consumption of inputs that Germany didn't have, requiring more imports, widening the gap the plan was supposed to close. By 1938, Germany's import dependency looked like this, according to trade and resource data compiled by Tooze. Oil, 65% imported, up from 60% in 1936. Rubber, 85% imported, down from 100%, but at 17 times the cost. Iron ore, 50% imported, up from 33% in 1936. Copper, 70% imported, unchanged. Food calories, 20% imported, up from 15% in 1936. The four-year plan had made Germany more vulnerable to blockade, not less. The regime had spent billions on synthetic production that consumed resources faster than it produced substitutes. Industrial capacity that could have produced consumer goods or conventional military equipment was instead tied up in massive, inefficient synthetic plants that required continuous subsidy. Wehrmacht logistics officers understood the disaster this created. A 1939 planning document, captured after the war and analyzed in the Wages of Destruction, estimated Germany's strategic reserves: oil for 2 months of combat operations, rubber for 3 months, copper for 6 months. The report concluded, Germany cannot sustain military operations beyond approximately 100 days without capturing enemy resources. Strategic planning must prioritize seizure of oil fields, industrial centers, and agricultural regions sufficient to continue operations. This is why the Nazi war economy had to be a conquest economy. The four-year plan's failure meant Germany needed to seize Romanian oil, Soviet grain, Czech industry, Polish agriculture, French resources. Not for ideological reasons, but for mathematical certainty. Without conquest, the Wehrmacht would literally run out of fuel and rubber before Christmas. Goering's response to evidence of the plan's failure was to demand acceleration. In a 1938 meeting, he told industrialists, "I don't care about costs. I don't care about efficiency. The Führer demands self-sufficiency, and we will achieve it." This was economic analysis replaced by ideological denial, pretending the laws of economics could be overcome through willpower. German economists who understood the situation faced an impossible choice: participate in a system they knew was doomed, or resist and face imprisonment. Most chose quiet compliance. Some, like Schacht, tried to apply brakes and were pushed aside. A few tried sabotage, slow walking orders, providing pessimistic projections, hoping somehow sanity would return. It wouldn't. The four-year plan's failure didn't cause the regime to reconsider autarky. It caused them to embrace conquest. If Germany couldn't produce what it needed, it would steal what it needed. The economic consequences of the four-year plan's failure appear clearly on a map. Look at what territories Germany invaded 1938 to 1941, and you're looking at a resource acquisition program disguised as military conquest. Austria, gold reserves. Czechoslovakia, industrial capacity and mineral deposits. Poland, agricultural land. Denmark and Norway, access to Swedish iron ore. Netherlands and Belgium, agricultural surplus. France, industrial capacity and colonial resources. Soviet Union, oil, grain, minerals, industrial capacity. The Nazi war economy was following a resource map, not an ideological agenda. And the reason it had to follow that map was because the four-year plan had proven that autarky was impossible. Germany would either seize the resources it needed from neighbors, or it would collapse under the weight of its own resource allocation failures. The bathtub was draining faster than it could possibly fill. War was the only way to turn off the drain, and even then, it would only work temporarily. Conquest economics, the plunder treadmill. March 12, 1938, 0600 hours. German troops crossed the Austrian border in the Anschluss, the annexation Hitler called a reunion of German peoples. By noon, Wehrmacht vehicles are rolling through Vienna. By evening, German financial officials are in the Austrian National Bank's vault, surrounded by gleaming stacks of gold bars. They count frantically, calculating how many months of economic breathing room this conquest just bought. The final tally, 280 tons of gold, worth approximately 1.7 billion Reichsmarks at 1938 exchange rates. Enough foreign currency reserves to keep Hitler's economy solvent for roughly 90 days. 3 months of survival, purchased with military invasion. This is conquest economics in its purest form, and the wages of destruction documents how it became the fundamental operating principle of the Nazi war economy. But here's what most economic analysis misses. Each conquest provided diminishing returns, and each created new costs that accelerated the need for the next conquest. Germany wasn't building an empire, it was feeding an addiction, and the doses needed to get the same economic high kept increasing while the intervals between fixes kept shrinking. Let's follow the money from that Austrian gold vault. The German officials who inventoried it, bureaucrats from the Reichsbank and Finance Ministry, understood they were witnessing a temporary reprieve, not a solution. One official, Wilhelm Vogt, later testified about the mood in the vault. We counted the gold bars with something approaching euphoria. The foreign exchange crisis that had paralyzed imports for 3 months suddenly vanished. We could buy oil, iron, or rubber. But even as we celebrated, the senior officials were calculating. At current consumption rates, this gold would last until June. Then what? The answer hung unspoken in that vault. Then we'd need more gold. Austria also provided industrial capacity and raw materials. The wages of destruction breaks down the seizures. Electrical generating capacity, adding 12% to German total. Iron ore deposits, manufacturing plants, agricultural output. On paper, this looked like substantial gain. In reality, Austrian industry required German inputs to operate, Austrian agriculture required German fertilizer, and the Austrian population required food and resources that Germany had to supply. The net economic benefit, calculated by Tooze from Nazi government economic records, positive for approximately 4 months, then slightly negative as occupation costs exceeded extraction value. September 1938. The Munich Agreement gives Hitler the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. German officials immediately inventory what they've gained: industrial machinery, textile factories, agricultural land. More importantly, Czech gold reserves and currency. The Sudetenland acquisition buys another 6 weeks of economic solvency. March 1939. Hitler seizes the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is the big score. Czech industry was among the most advanced in Europe. The Škoda Works alone manufactured more weapons than all British armaments factories combined. Czech gold reserves, carefully hidden but discovered through informants, 44 tons, plus $14 million in foreign exchange. The industrial equipment, factories, and skilled workers represented hundreds of millions in value. German economic planners believed the Czech seizure had solved the resource allocation crisis. A March 1939 Reich Ministry report optimistically projected that Czech industrial capacity could sustain German rearmament for 2 to 3 years. They were catastrophically wrong. By August 1939, just 5 months later, the economic benefits of the Czech conquest were exhausted. Why? First, Czech industry required raw material inputs Germany didn't have. The Škoda Works needed steel, which needed iron ore, which needed foreign exchange to import. Running Czech factories at full capacity actually increased German import dependency. Second, Czech skilled workers required wages, food, and resources. The regime had to feed and house the Czech population, while extracting their industrial output. Occupation costs mounted. Third, and most insidiously, the military-industrial complex expanded to consume whatever capacity the conquest provided. German war production didn't stabilize at a sustainable level. It grew to fill available capacity, which meant each territorial gain disappeared into expanded military production that required even more resources. Think of it like economic heroin addiction. The first dose, Austria, provides euphoria. The second dose, Sudetenland, provides less euphoria, requires more to achieve the same effect. The third dose, Czech takeover, provides even less high, but now the addict's system depends on regular doses just to function normally. The interval between doses shrinks. The dose size increases. The diminishing returns accelerate. And eventually no dose is enough. Wehrmacht logistics officers saw this with terrifying clarity. A September 1939 supply assessment, captured after the war and cited in the Wages of Destruction, calculated Germany's strategic reserves after consuming Czech resources. Oil, 2.3 months of combat operations rubber, 3.1 months copper, 4.2 months food, 8 months, assuming normal harvest. The four-year plan's failure meant Germany needed to seize Romanian oil, Soviet grain, Czech industry, Polish agriculture, French resources. Not for ideological reasons, but for mathematical certainty. Without conquest, the Wehrmacht would literally run out of fuel and rubber before Christmas. Goering's response to evidence of the plan's failure was to demand acceleration. In a 1938 meeting, he told industrialists, "I don't care about costs. I don't care about efficiency. The Führer demands self-sufficiency, and we will achieve it." This was economic analysis replaced by ideological denial, pretending the laws of economics could be overcome through willpower. German economists who understood the situation faced an impossible choice: participate in a system they knew was doomed, or resist and face imprisonment. Most chose quiet compliance. Some, like Schacht, tried to apply brakes and were pushed aside. A few tried sabotage, slow-walking orders, providing pessimistic projections, hoping somehow sanity would return. It wouldn't. The four-year plan's failure didn't cause the regime to reconsider autarky. It caused them to embrace conquest. If Germany couldn't produce what it needed, it would steal what it needed. The economic consequences of the four-year plan's failure appear clearly on a map. Look at what territories Germany invaded 1938 to 1941, and you're looking at a resource acquisition program disguised as military conquest. Austria, gold reserves. Czechoslovakia, industrial capacity and mineral deposits. Poland, agricultural land. Denmark and Norway, access to Swedish iron ore. Netherlands and Belgium, agricultural surplus. France, industrial capacity and colonial resources. Soviet Union, oil, grain, minerals, industrial capacity. The Nazi war economy was following a resource map, not an ideological agenda. And the reason it had to follow that map was because the four-year plan had proven that autarky was impossible. Germany would either seize the resources it needed from neighbors, or it would collapse under the weight of its own resource allocation failures. The bathtub was draining faster than it could possibly fill. War was the only way to turn off the drain, and even then, it would only work temporarily. Conquest economics, the plunder treadmill. March 12, 1938, 0600 hours. German troops crossed the Austrian border in the Anschluss, the annexation Hitler called a reunion of German peoples. By noon, Wehrmacht vehicles are rolling through Vienna. By evening, German financial officials are in the Austrian National Bank's vault, surrounded by gleaming stacks of gold bars. They count frantically, calculating how many months of economic breathing room this conquest just bought. The final tally, 280 tons of gold, worth approximately 1.7 billion Reichsmarks at 1938 exchange rates. Enough foreign currency reserves to keep Hitler's economy solvent for roughly 90 days. 3 months of survival, purchased with military invasion. This is conquest economics in its purest form, and the Wages of Destruction documents how it became the fundamental operating principle of the Nazi war economy. But here's what most economic analysis misses. Each conquest provided diminishing returns, and each created new costs that accelerated the need for the next conquest. Germany wasn't building an empire, it was feeding an addiction, and the doses needed to get the same economic high kept increasing while the intervals between fixes kept shrinking. Let's follow the money from that Austrian gold vault. The German officials who inventoried it, bureaucrats from the Reichsbank and Finance Ministry, understood they were witnessing a temporary reprieve, not a solution. One official, Wilhelm Vogt, later testified about the mood in the vault. "We counted the gold bars with something approaching euphoria. The foreign exchange crisis that had paralyzed imports for 3 months suddenly vanished. We could buy oil, iron, or rubber. But even as we celebrated, the senior officials were calculating. At current consumption rates, this gold would last until June. Then what? The answer hung unspoken in that vault. Then we'd need more gold." Austria also provided industrial capacity and raw materials. The wages of destruction breaks down the seizures. Electrical generating capacity, adding 12% to German total. Iron ore deposits, manufacturing plants, agricultural output. On paper, this looked like substantial gain. In reality, Austrian industry required German inputs to operate, Austrian agriculture required German fertilizer, and the Austrian population required food and resources that Germany had to supply. The net economic benefit, calculated by Tooze from Nazi government economic records, positive for approximately 4 months, then slightly negative as occupation costs exceeded extraction value. September 1938. The Munich Agreement gives Hitler the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. German officials immediately inventory what they've gained: industrial machinery, textile factories, agricultural land. More importantly, Czech gold reserves and currency. The Sudetenland acquisition buys another 6 weeks of economic solvency. March 1939. Hitler seizes the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is the big score. Czech industry was among the most advanced in Europe. The Skoda works alone manufactured more weapons than all British armaments factories combined. Czech gold reserves, carefully hidden but discovered through informants, 44 tons, plus $14 million in foreign exchange. The industrial equipment, factories, and skilled workers represented hundreds of millions in value. German economic planners believed the Czech seizure had solved the resource allocation crisis. A March 1939 Reich Ministry report optimistically projected that Czech industrial capacity could sustain German rearmament for 2 to 3 years. They were catastrophically wrong. By August 1939, just 5 months later, the economic benefits of the Czech conquest were exhausted. Why? First, Czech industry required raw material inputs Germany didn't have. The Skoda works needed steel, which needed iron ore, which needed foreign exchange to import. Running Czech factories at full capacity actually increased German import dependency. Second, Czech skilled workers required wages, food, and resources. The regime had to feed and house the Czech population while extracting their industrial output. Occupation costs mounted. Third, and most insidiously, the military-industrial complex expanded to consume whatever capacity the conquest provided. German war production didn't stabilize at a sustainable level. It grew to fill available capacity, which meant each territorial gain disappeared into expanded military production that required even more resources. Think of it like economic heroin addiction. The first dose, Austria, provides euphoria. The second dose, Sudetenland, provides less euphoria, requires more to achieve the same effect. The third dose, Czech takeover, provides even less high, but now the addict system depends on regular doses just to function normally. The interval between doses shrinks. The dose size increases. The diminishing returns accelerate. And eventually no dose is enough. Wehrmacht logistics officers saw this with terrifying clarity. A September 1939 supply assessment, captured after the war and cited in the Wages of Destruction, calculated Germany's strategic reserves after consuming Czech resources. Oil, 2.3 months of combat operations. Rubber, 3.1 months. Copper, 4.2 months FUD, 8 months, assuming normal harvest. The Czech conquest had bought time, but time was running out faster than conquest could replenish it. One Wehrmacht colonel, Hans Oster, who would later join the resistance, wrote in his private diary in August 1939, "Each conquest makes the next conquest more necessary. Austria bought us 3 months. Czechoslovakia bought us 5 months. But now we consume resources faster than we acquire them. We are on a treadmill that's accelerating. Eventually we'll be running invasions monthly, then weekly, then we'll simply collapse mid-stride." September 1, 1939. Germany invades Poland. The economic calculus that drove this decision is stark. German foreign exchange reserves hit zero in August. The Mefo bills were coming due with no way to pay them. The Nazi war economy faced immediate collapse without new resource acquisition. Poland offered agricultural land, coal deposits, industrial facilities, and most critically, a grain surplus that could feed German cities while domestic agriculture supported the military. The economic planning documents for the invasion, analyzed by Tooze, show resource extraction targets: 3 million tons of grain annually, coal from Silesian mines, industrial output from Lodz and Warsaw factories. But Poland also presented a new problem. Occupation costs exceeded extraction value almost immediately. Poland's economy had to be reorganized, its population controlled, its resistance suppressed. German administrators flooded into occupied Poland. German soldiers garrisoned cities. German logistics sustained the occupation. A German economic official, Hans Frank, governed occupied Poland. His diary, discovered after the war, reveals the impossible math he faced. We extract grain, coal, and industrial output worth approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks annually. The occupation costs approximately 2.3 billion Reichsmarks annually. Poland is a net economic drain, not a resource. We are spending money, we don't have to extract resources we cannot profitably use. The Conquest economics trap was fully sprung by late 1939. Germany had invaded 3 countries and economically absorbed parts of several others. Each conquest had provided temporary resource relief. Each had created long-term occupation costs. And the Nazi war economy was now consuming resources faster than plunder could provide them. The wages of destruction presents the devastating calculation. By December 1939, Germany's military and occupation costs exceeded the value extracted from conquered territories by approximately 15%. The empire was running at a loss. Every month, the gap widened. Every month, the need for new conquest became more urgent. This is why the WW2 war machine couldn't stop. Not because Hitler was insatiable, though he was, but because stopping meant economic collapse within weeks. The treadmill was now running so fast that stepping off meant being flung into oblivion. French invasion, April-June 1940. The planning documents don't talk primarily about military objectives. They talk about coal from Lorraine, iron ore from Normandy, industrial capacity from Paris, agricultural surplus from French farms. The Wehrmacht isn't just conquering territory. It's conducting an economic raid on industrial scale. France provides the biggest score yet: gold reserves, industrial machinery, agricultural output, colonial resources. For a brief moment in summer 1940, German economic planners believe they've finally achieved sustainability. French resources, combined with existing conquests, seem sufficient to maintain the military-industrial complex indefinitely. The euphoria lasts approximately 6 weeks. By August 1940, the consumption rate has accelerated to match available resources. By September, resource allocation crises are mounting again. The French occupation costs more than projected. French industrial output, stripped of normal trading relationships and integrated into the German war economy, produces less than expected. The colonial resources require complex logistics and don't solve fundamental shortages. And the biggest resource deficit remains unsolved: oil. Romanian oil fields provide some relief, but not enough. German synthetic fuel production, despite enormous investment, covers only 35% of military needs. The rest must be imported or extracted from conquered territory. By late 1940, German economic planners are staring at maps of Soviet oil fields in Baku and calculating. Not because of ideology, not because of racial theories, but because economic analysis shows that without Soviet oil, the Nazi war economy collapses within 12 to 18 months. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Union, is economically motivated at its core. The planning documents, cited extensively in the Wages of Destruction, make this explicit. The operation's primary objective is the seizure of grain, oil, and industrial resources sufficient to make Germany economically self-sustaining. Military victory over Soviet forces is the means, not the end. The end is economic autarky through territorial conquest. The Germans calculated they needed Soviet resources to survive. What they didn't calculate was that the Soviet Union would be the conquest that broke the treadmill. The occupation costs of Soviet territory, the logistical nightmare of extracting resources from destroyed infrastructure, the partisan resistance, the continued military operations, all of it drained resources faster than extraction could provide them. By late 1941, the Conquest economics model had reached its mathematical endpoint. Germany occupied most of Europe, extracting resources on an unprecedented scale. And it still wasn't enough. The military-industrial complex had grown so large that no conceivable conquest could feed it. The treadmill had accelerated beyond sustainable speed. The economic consequences were inevitable. The empire would consume itself, one failed harvest or bottleneck at a time, until the entire structure collapsed. The only question was how long the collapse would take and how much destruction it would cause. The wages of destruction were coming due, and the bill was written in the blood of 50 million people. September 1939, gambling on economic collapse. August 22, 1939, the Reichsbank conference room in Berlin. The smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hangs in the air thick enough to taste. Senior officials from the Finance Ministry, Economics Ministry, and the Reichsbank itself sit around a polished oak table covered in statistical reports and balance sheets. The numbers they're reviewing tell a story of imminent economic apocalypse. Walther Funk, Schacht's replacement as Reichsbank president, reads from a summary document. Current foreign exchange reserves, 76 million Reichsmarks. Import requirements for August, 285 million Reichsmarks. The gap is unsustainable. We face total depletion by September 15th. Without foreign exchange, we cannot import oil, rubber, or iron ore. Without those imports, military production ceases within 6 weeks. The room is silent except for the scratch of pens as officials annotate their copies. Everyone understands what this means. Hitler's economy is approximately 3 weeks from systemic collapse. One man is notably absent from this meeting. Hjalmar Schacht resigned as Reichsbank president in January 1939. His resignation letter, now declassified and analyzed in the Wages of Destruction, had warned precisely of this moment. The letter deserves extensive quotation because it represents one of the most prophetic economic analyses in modern history. The present fiscal and monetary policy pursued by the Reich government leads inevitably to catastrophic inflation and economic collapse. The Mefo bill scheme, which I designed as a temporary measure to facilitate rearmament, has expanded beyond sustainable limits. Approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills remain outstanding with no credible redemption mechanism. The foreign exchange crisis worsens monthly. Import dependencies have increased rather than decreased despite four-year plan expenditures. The regime faces a binary choice. Either curtail military spending by approximately 60 to 70% and accept a severe economic recession as the Mefo bills are gradually redeemed through legitimate fiscal means, or pursue territorial expansion sufficient to acquire gold reserves, foreign exchange, and resources capable of supporting current military expenditure levels indefinitely. The first option requires political, while the regime demonstrably lacks. The second option requires military conquest on a scale that will inevitably trigger general European war. Either option is economically rational. The current course, maintaining existing military spending without fiscal reform or territorial expansion, is economically impossible and will result in total systemic failure within 6 to 12 months. Hitler read Schacht's letter, filed it, and continued current policy. Because changing course was politically impossible, and admitting the economic trap was psychologically impossible. So he chose the third option that Schacht had said didn't exist. Gamble everything on one more conquest. Hope Poland's resources by enough time to figure out what comes next. The cabinet meeting where Hitler made the final decision to invade Poland happened on August 23, 1939, one day after the Reichsbank meeting revealed impending economic collapse. No recording exists, but participants' later testimony, compiled by historians and analyzed in the Wages of Destruction, reveals what was said. Funk presented the economic situation. Hermann Goering, now responsible for war economy planning, argued that Poland's seizure would provide enough grain, coal, and industrial capacity to stabilize the situation. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of Wehrmacht High Command, warned that military forces were not ready for general European war. Hitler responded with his characteristic calculation. Gentlemen, we face not a choice between war and peace, but between war now and economic collapse immediately. The Reichsbank reports we have perhaps 3 weeks of foreign exchange. Britain and France will protest Polish invasion, but likely won't intervene militarily. We seize Poland, we gain resources, we stabilize the economic situation, and we've avoided general war. If we don't invade, our economy collapses by October, and the regime falls anyway. We have no choice. This is the economic logic of September 1st, 1939. Not madness, not ideology run amok, but cold calculation that economic death was certain without action and merely probable with it. The thematic analogy is jumping from a burning building. Death from the fall is possible, death from the fire is certain, so you jump and hope for a miracle. The final week of August 1939 saw frantic preparation. The Nazi war economy converted from peacetime to wartime operations, a process that itself reveals the economic desperation. Consumer goods production was curtailed. Rationing began immediately. Fuel allocations to civilian use were cut 60%. These weren't preparations for a long war. They were emergency measures to squeeze every possible resource toward military operations. Meanwhile, the Mefo bills were coming due in amounts that made redemption impossible. The Reichsbank documents show that August 1939 saw 1.8 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills reach maturity. The Reichsbank had neither the foreign exchange nor the gold reserves to redeem them. Banks holding the bills began demanding payment with increasing urgency. The government's solution: issue new Mefo bills to redeem old ones, while promising that Polish conquest would soon provide the gold and foreign exchange to make the whole system solvent. This was financial alchemy approaching terminal absurdity, using future plunder to pay for current obligations, while using current credit to finance the invasion that would supposedly secure future plunder. German banks, realizing the house of cards was collapsing, began quietly hedging. The Deutsche Bank's internal memoranda from late August 1939 show executives discussing exposure to Mefo bills. We hold 520 million Reichsmarks in bills that are effectively worthless if the Polish campaign fails to secure sufficient resource extraction. We are entirely dependent on military success for financial survival. The bank's fate is now tied to Wehrmacht performance. This wasn't an economy preparing for war. This was an economy whose failure necessitated war. September 1st, 1939, 0445 hours. German forces crossed the Polish border. Within hours, Britain and France declare war. Hitler's gamble that the invasion could be localized has failed catastrophically. Germany now faces exactly the general European war that Schacht warned would result from pursuing conquest economics as a solution to fiscal insolvency. The economic consequences of that failure became apparent within weeks. Poland's resources, real and substantial, now had to support not just the German occupation, but also military operations against Britain and France. The resource windfall that was supposed to solve the crisis instead barely covered the costs of acquiring it. Wehrmacht logistics reports from September-October 1939, cited in the Wages of Destruction, show the grim accounting. Fuel consumption during Polish campaign: 8 million tons fuel acquired from Polish seizure, 2.3 million tons net fuel position, minus 5.7 million tons ammunition expended, 1.2 million tons industrial capacity to replace expended ammunition, 8 months at full production. The Polish campaign hadn't solved the resource allocation crisis. It had made it worse by triggering general war and consuming irreplaceable resources faster than conquest could replenish them. By October 1939, German economic planners faced the reality that the gamble had failed. They'd jumped from the building hoping to land in a pool of water. Instead, they'd landed on a treadmill running at even higher speed, and now British and French forces were shooting at them while they ran. The military-industrial complex now faced demands it couldn't meet. War with Britain and France required air forces, naval forces, and sustained industrial production beyond anything the original rearmament had planned for. The French campaign would require resources Germany had calculated spending on 5 years of peacetime operations. And the Mefo bills kept coming due. Through late 1939 and early 1940, the Reichsbank quietly defaulted on portions of the Mefo obligations, allowing bills to mature unredeemed while issuing new credit instruments to paper over the gap. The German banking system developed a parallel economy of real money and various forms of government credit, all operating on the faith that military conquest would eventually make the math work. It wouldn't. The Wages of Destruction demonstrates that by January 1940, Nazi Germany economics had entered an irreversible spiral. The economy was sustained entirely by territorial expansion, but territorial expansion now triggered counteroffensives that consumed resources faster than extraction provided them. The treadmill had become a death trap. Hitler's response to this impossible situation was to accelerate. If one conquest wasn't enough, invade France. If Western Europe wasn't enough, invade Soviet Union. If Soviet Union wasn't enough, there was no if enough. The economic model required perpetual expansion until something broke. And eventually, inevitably, something would break. The September 1939 gamble was doomed from the moment Schacht's resignation letter identified the trap. But the regime took the gamble anyway, because the alternative was certain immediate collapse. They chose possible death through war over certain death through economic implosion. In the end, they got both. The wages of destruction. How economics doomed the Third Reich. June 22, 1941, 0315 hours. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. The official justification speaks of ideological necessity, living space, the crusade against Bolshevism. But the economic reality documented in Wehrmacht planning files and analyzed in the wages of destruction tells a different story. This wasn't conquest for ideology. This was economic desperation disguised as military strategy. A planning document from April 1941, drafted by Wehrmacht economic staff and marked streng geheim, states the invasion's purpose with brutal clarity. The operation aims to make Germany independent of external supply sources. Soviet grain will feed German cities. Soviet oil will fuel German military forces. Soviet industrial capacity will augment German production. The military campaign is the means. Economic autarky is the objective. Without Soviet resources, the Reich cannot sustain military operations beyond 1942. The document then includes a chilling addendum, written by some anonymous planner who understood the stakes. This operation is economically necessary. It is also probably impossible to succeed. The resources we need to seize are located 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers beyond the Soviet border. The logistics of extraction will require infrastructure we will likely destroy during conquest. The occupation costs will exceed extraction value for potentially years. We are invading because we must, not because we can afford to. This is Hitler's economy in summer 1941. So desperate for resource allocation that it launches an invasion planners acknowledge is economically unsustainable, because not invading means certain collapse within 12 months. Adam Tooze's analysis in The Wages of Destruction reveals that Barbarossa wasn't Hitler's choice. It was the Nazi war economy's last desperate gamble. The first 6 months of Barbarossa seemed to validate the gamble. German forces captured vast territories, millions of prisoners, enormous industrial centers. By December 1941, Wehrmacht forces were positioned near Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, approaching grain-producing regions of Ukraine, threatening Moscow itself. But the economic analysis already showed the operation was failing by its own metrics. German officials cataloging seized resources sent increasingly desperate reports back to Berlin. A November 1941 assessment from the Economic Staff East, responsible for resource extraction from occupied Soviet territory, documented the catastrophic gap between expectations and reality. Grain stocks acquired, 2.1 million tons, versus target of 8 million tons. Gap explained by Soviet scorched earth policy, infrastructure destruction, and weather-related harvest failures. Current grain acquisition rate provides 15% of projected requirement. Oil production in occupied territories, 140,000 tons monthly, versus target of 2 million tons monthly. Gap explained by refinery destruction, lack of skilled workers, partisan sabotage, and logistical inability to transport captured oil to Germany. Industrial equipment seizure, successful, but relocation to German factories requires rail capacity currently needed for military logistics. Estimated timeline to make seized Soviet industrial capacity productive, 18 to 24 months. In plain language, the invasion meant to solve Germany's resource allocation crisis had instead created resource demands far exceeding any resources acquired. The Wehrmacht was consuming fuel, ammunition, and supplies at rates that made extraction from occupied territory economically meaningless. The Nazi war economy was devouring itself faster than it could plunder. Walk through a German aircraft factory in early 1943, and the economic collapse becomes visceral. The smell hits you first, ersatz lubricants that don't quite work, producing acrid smoke as machinery runs hot. The sound is wrong too. Presses that should hum smoothly instead clatter and grind. metal stressed beyond specification. The visual tells the story. Aluminum components that should be smoothly formed showing stress cracks because alloy quality has degraded. Parts that don't quite fit because precision machining requires tools made from metals Germany no longer has. Kurt Tank, the designer of the Focke-Wulf 190 fighter, wrote in a 1943 memo to the Air Ministry that the wages of destruction quotes extensively. We can no longer build the aircraft we designed. Aluminum quality has degraded such that components fail at 70% of specified stress tolerance. Substitute materials introduced to cope with copper shortages produce electrical systems with 40% failure rates. Engine performance has declined 15% because synthetic lubricants cannot handle operating temperatures. We are building aircraft that look identical to 1940 models, but perform significantly worse due to resource constraints we cannot overcome. This wasn't isolated to aircraft. Industrial production across the Nazi war economy was experiencing quality collapse as resource shortages forced substitution of inferior materials. Tanks with transmission failures from substandard steel. Submarines with electrical systems that sparked and failed. Artillery shells with fuses that didn't detonate or detonated prematurely. The military-industrial complex that was supposed to sustain German conquest was instead crumbling under the weight of resource depletion. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, fought desperately against the economic consequences of war. His diaries from 1943 to 1944, preserved in German archives and analyzed in The Wages of Destruction, read like economic horror stories. A September 1943 entry captures the desperation. Met with synthetic rubber production directors. Current output, 12,000 tons monthly versus requirement of 25,000 tons monthly. The shortfall means Wehrmacht vehicle operations will be restricted to essential missions only beginning October. Asked when production could increase to meet demand. Director Krauch stated, "Never. Each synthetic plant requires electrical capacity we no longer have, coal we can barely transport, and skilled workers who've been conscripted. We're producing at maximum possible capacity. The gap will only widen." The supply chain management that modern businesses obsess over had completely collapsed in Nazi Germany. Resource allocation became a zero-sum game. Allocate coal to synthetic fuel plants or to steel production. Assign rail capacity to ammunition transport or food distribution. Dedicate skilled workers to aircraft factories or submarine construction. Every choice meant accepting catastrophic shortfalls elsewhere. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the arsenal of democracy was operating at scales that made German industrial production look quaint. The economic analysis that Hitler had feared in 1938 was manifesting with crushing reality by 1943. American industrial capacity had fully mobilized, and the production statistics were staggering. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 85,000 aircraft versus Germany's 25,000. 29,000 tanks versus Germany's 12,000. 2.3 million tons of steel for military purposes monthly versus Germany's 1.1 million tons, and declining. 41 billion rounds of ammunition versus Germany's estimated 12 billion. These weren't just numbers on economic reports. These were production bottlenecks that no amount of German efficiency could overcome. Albert Speer, reviewing intelligence reports on American industrial production in late 1943, wrote in his diary, "We are not losing this war tactically. We are being buried under an avalanche of industrial capacity we cannot hope to match. For every tank we build, America builds 3. For every aircraft they build 4. The economic consequences are simple. We will run out of equipment before they run out of soldiers to use it. This is not a war economy. This is economic suicide." The bombing campaign against German industrial production accelerated the collapse. The synthetic fuel plants that Speer had desperately tried to expand became priority targets for Allied bombers. By mid-1944, German synthetic fuel production had dropped from 195,000 tons monthly to 52,000 tons. Luftwaffe training flights were cancelled to conserve fuel. Panzer divisions sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. The Nazi war machine was grinding to a halt not because it lacked tanks or aircraft, but because it lacked the fuel to operate them. Walk through the Luna synthetic fuel plant in Saxony after a bombing raid in May 1944, and you witness the economic collapse made tangible. Twisted pipes leak chemicals that should be refined into aviation fuel. Catalytic chambers designed to operate at precise temperatures lie shattered, their specialized equipment impossible to replace because the metals required no longer exist in German stockpiles. Workers, many of them slave laborers from occupied territories, pick through wreckage knowing the plant won't restart for months, if ever. A production engineer at Luna, interrogated by Allied investigators after the war, described the psychological impact. "We knew we'd lost by late 1944. Not lost battles, lost the economic war. Every destroyed plant took longer to repair. Every resource shortage grew more severe. We were mining inferior coal because good seams were exhausted, processing poor quality, or because high-grade deposits were depleted. The Nazi economy had consumed Germany's industrial capacity and was now consuming the wreckage." The resource war that Hitler's economy had launched in 1939 reached its inevitable conclusion. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered from France to the Volga, was now retreating on all fronts, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because German factories couldn't supply them. The wages of destruction documents the month-by-month collapse. January 1944, German oil reserves dropped to 300,000 tons, representing 45 days of Wehrmacht consumption at reduced operational tempo. April 1944, ammunition production restricted by copper shortages. Artillery units receive 40% of projected shell allocation. July 1944, synthetic rubber production falls below minimum necessary to maintain existing vehicle fleet. Tank divisions cannibalize vehicles to keep others operational. October 1944, coal shortages force closure of steel plants. Industrial production enters freefall. January 1945, German war economy effectively ceases to function as transportation network collapses. The economic analysis that Adam Tooze conducted in The Wages of Destruction reveals a brutal truth. Nazi Germany was economically doomed from the moment it embraced rearmament through debt in 1933. Every conquest delayed the collapse but made the eventual reckoning worse. Every plundered resource funded temporary survival while deepening long-term dependency. The Nazi war economy was like a shark. It had to keep moving to survive, but each movement consumed energy faster than it could acquire new food sources. Modern economists examining Nazi Germany's economic model recognize disturbing parallels. Debt-fueled growth that creates the illusion of prosperity while building unsustainable obligations. Resource dependencies that force aggressive foreign policies. Industrial capacity that serves military production at the expense of civilian welfare. The economic consequences of these choices become apparent only when the system can no longer sustain itself through expansion. The wages of destruction were paid in full by 1945. The Nazi economy that promised prosperity delivered poverty. The military-industrial complex that promised security delivered devastation. The resource allocation strategy that promised autarky delivered dependency and collapse. Hitler's economy, built on debt and sustained through plunder, imploded exactly as its internal logic guaranteed it would. And while Nazi Germany's factories crumbled and its armies retreated, American industrial production continued expanding. The arsenal of democracy had won the economic war so decisively that military victory became inevitable. The Wages of Destruction demonstrates that World War II wasn't decided by superior tactics or braver soldiers. It was decided by economic capacity, resource allocation, and industrial production scales that Nazi Germany could never match. This is the lesson Adam Tooze extracted from years of studying Nazi economic records. Economics shapes history more powerfully than ideology. Hitler's economy made World War II economically inevitable, and made German defeat equally inevitable. The war economy built on lies couldn't defeat the industrial capacity built on genuine productivity. The resource war launched by a resource-poor nation couldn't succeed against nations with superior economic foundations. The wages of destruction were calculated in Berlin starting in 1933, accumulated through debt and plunder through 1941, and paid in full through economic collapse and total defeat by 1945. This is how Hitler's economy fueled World War II, and how economic reality ultimately destroyed the Third Reich.